Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And when we left off at the end of the last session, we're in the middle of the chapter titled Wednesday, July 24th, 1974. So that's where we'll resume now. As always, Bazart moved methodically. He located the reference to the June 23rd conversation on the special prosecutor's subpoena. The presidential log and diary verified that the meeting with Haldeman had taken place in the Oval Office between 10:04 and 11:39 a.m. Bazart called a Secret Service agent and requested the reel. As he waited for the tape to be brought from the EOB storage vault, he prepared his listening equipment. The erase button on his Sony 800B recorder was already electrically disconnected, but he took the extra precaution of jamming the mechanism by placing a plastic block under the erase button, making it impossible to depress. He felt that his precautions were well taken, since there were no copies of this tape. This was the original of a tape that the president himself had described as a, quote, problem. The word problem was frequently a presidential euphemism for disaster, but it could also be a signal of overreaction. Bazart thought the president was oddly lacking in judgment about certain matters. He did either too little or too much. When there had been leaks, he had gone beyond all reason. He had created the plumbers. He had approved the Houston plan. He had underreacted to John Dean, failing at first to see the damage Dean could do him. Then he had overreacted to the fact that Dean had squirreled away a number of documents. When Haldeman and Ehrlichman were implicated in the cover-up, he had overreacted to the demands for an intensified investigation and had allowed a special prosecutor to be appointed. The Saturday Night Massacre was another exaggerated response. Nixon had miscalculated about the tapes. He should have burned them straight away, Bazart believed. The ferocious battle to keep them had riveted public attention, had created a national obsession. Afterward, the president had shifted suddenly and given up a batch of them. Then he had dumped 1,200 pages of transcripts on the public, but by editing them indiscriminately, lost whatever advantage he might have gained from the act. Nixon could not seem to grasp the fact that there would be a public reckoning. Len Garment was right, Bazart thought. Watergate was a series of discrete, unrelated transactions. There had been no grand strategy, just consistently bad judgment. For some time, Bazart had been half waiting for something that would totally undermine the president's defense. He had brought himself around to the notion that maybe it wasn't in the tapes of Nixon's Watergate discussions. He still thought that, technically at least, the president had not broken the law in the cover-up. If there was a problem, Bazart thought, it was more likely in the area of his finances or in the abuses of the Internal Revenue Service. In June, the president had asked him how the Supreme Court would deal with matters of national security on the tapes, indicating that there might be some problem in that area. They've got to give us some room on national security, Nixon had said. How's that going to work, Fred? Bazart said he had no idea how the court might treat such matters. Perhaps Bazart was now going to hear that national security problem. That must be why the president wanted him to listen. Bazart knew the date, June 23, 1972, well. In his statement of May 22, 1973, the president had denied any political motivation in his instructions to Haldeman on June 23rd. It was 40 minutes before the reel arrived. Bazart removed it from its cardboard box and threaded it into the machine. He put on the large headphones. He had little trouble finding the beginning of the conversation, since it was the first on the reel. He was used to having to thread through hundreds of feet of tape. There was a period of silence, and then he heard Haldeman's voice. It was a routine chat between him and the president, setting up a meeting with Secretary of State William Rogers. Then Haldeman said, "Now, on the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control, because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control them, and their investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank, sources, the banker himself. And it goes in some directions we don't want it to go." Bazart realized that he was one of the few people to listen to a tape of a conversation that had taken place so soon after the break-in. Apparently, the only earlier reference to Watergate on the subpoenaed tape had been on the infamous June 20th recording in the obliterated 18.5 minutes of conversation between Haldeman and the president. Bozart thought Haldeman was giving a pretty full and knowledgeable explanation of the early Watergate investigation. What did he mean by being back in the problem area? By the FBI is not under control? By leading into some productive areas? Perhaps these were references to national security matters, perhaps not. Haldeman continued. Mitchell came up with yesterday, and John Dean analyzed very carefully last night and concurs now with Mitchell's recommendation, that the only way to solve this, and we're set up beautifully to do it, that the way to handle this now is for us to have Walters call Pat Gray and just say, stay the hell out of this business here. We don't want you to go any further on it. That's not an unusual development, and that would take care of it. Bozart recognized the connection. The president had acknowledged 14 months before that. The president acknowledged 14 months before that Haldeman and Ehrlichman had contacted CIA Deputy Director Walters to, quote, ensure that the investigation of the break-in not expose either an unrelated covert operation of the CIA or the activities of the White House Investigations Unit, Plumbers. But the president had also declared in his statement of May 22nd, it was certainly not my intent nor my wish that the investigation of the Watergate break-in or of related acts be impeded in any way. Bozart's spirits fell. The tape established that Haldeman intended to use the CIA to impede the investigation of Watergate. Furthermore, it laid the origin of the plan to Mitchell. Perhaps the president would bring up a legitimate national security consideration. That might muddy the waters. They had faced a similar difficulty with the tape for March 21, 1973, when Nixon had appeared to authorize the payment of hush money to Hunt. The president's lawyers had argued that, in fact, Nixon had turned off the proposal later in the same conversation, though Bozart had always been dubious about that claim. Things looked grim this time, but Bozart was one to hold out hope. What about Pat Gray? You mean Pat Gray doesn't want to? Nixon asked. Pat doesn't want to, Haldeman answered. He doesn't know how to, and he doesn't have any basis for doing it. Given this, he will then have the basis. Bozart listened as the president asked questions about the investigation, and Haldeman explained how the Dahlberg and Texas money had left a trail. In a footnote, they explained Kenneth H. Dahlberg, a Nixon campaign fundraiser, collected $25,000 in cash contributions, converted the funds to a cashier's check, and turned it over to the Nixon Re-Election Committee in Washington. The check was then deposited in the bank account of Bernard Barker, one of the Watergate burglars. It provided investigators with the first link between the burglary and Nixon campaign cash. Manuel Ogario, a Mexican lawyer, served as a conduit for contributions from Texas donors to the Nixon campaign. The money was laundered through his bank in Mexico City to make the funds untraceable. In addition to the Dahlberg check, 4 checks drawn on Ogario's account and totaling $89,000 were deposited in Barker's account. Gradually, the president got Haldeman's point. Referring to the money his campaign aides had sent to the laundry, he asked, "What do they say? They were approached by the Cubans?" That's what Dahlberg has to say, the Texans too. Is that the idea? Well, if they will. But then we're relying on more and more people all the time. That's the problem. And they'll stop if we take this other step, said Haldeman, returning to Mitchell's cover-up plan. All right, fine, said the president. And they seem to feel the thing to do is to get them to stop, said Haldeman. Right, fine, said Nixon. They say the only way to do that is from White House instructions, and it's got to be to CIA Director Helms and, Walters, said Haldeman. Bozart felt that there was a potential smoking gun. The president had personally approved an initial step in the Watergate cover-up, not from ignorance, but after an explanation of the political pressures, in order to cover a money trail that led back to his re-election committee. And the proposal would be that Ehrlichman and I call them, the CIA officials, in, continued Haldeman. All right, fine, Nixon said impatiently. How do you call him in? I mean, we protected Helms from one hell of a lot of things. That's what Ehrlichman says. Of course, this is Hunt. That will uncover a lot of things, Nixon said. You open that scab, there's a hell of a lot of things, and we just feel that it would be very detrimental to have this thing go any further. This involves these Cubans, Hunt, and a lot of hanky-panky that we have nothing to do with ourselves." Now Bizart saw how the president had been able to sell himself the national security justification. "Well, what the hell," Nixon said. "Did Mitchell know about this thing to any much of a degree?" The reference was to the Watergate bugging. "I think so," Haldeman responded. "I don't think he knew the details, but I think he knew." The exchange, Bizart was painfully aware, undercut the president's claim that he had known of no Watergate involvement by his assistants until John Dean came to him the following March. It put Nixon right in the middle of the cover-up. It gave him a reason to cover up. He was concealing the involvement of his campaign manager, Mitchell. And the tone disclosed even more. There was no surprise or indignation. "Did Mitchell know about this thing to any much of a degree?" the president had asked. He either knew of or had strongly guessed at Mitchell's involvement. Nixon continued. "He didn't know how it was going to be handled, though, with Dahlberg and the Texans and so forth." "Well, who was the asshole that did? Is it Liddy? Is that the fellow? He must be a little nuts." "He is. I mean, he just isn't well screwed on, is he? Isn't that the problem?" asked Nixon. "No, but he was under pressure, apparently, to get more information, and as he got more pressure, he pushed the people harder to move harder on—" "Pressure from Mitchell?" asked Nixon. "Apparently." "Oh, Mitchell," Nixon said. "Mitchell was at the point that you made on this, that exactly what I need from you is on the—" "Gemstone, yeah," Haldeman said. It wasn't absolutely clear to Bizart, but it sounded like Gemstone, the secret code name for Gordon Liddy's espionage plan that included electronic eavesdropping and break-in at the Watergate. Certainly Haldeman was not holding back from the president. "All right, fine," the president said abruptly. "I understand it all. We won't second-guess Mitchell and the rest. Thank God it wasn't Colson." Haldeman told the president that the FBI, after interviewing Colson, had concluded that the break-in was not a White House operation, but probably a CIA scheme, Cubans and the CIA. "So the CIA turnoff would," he said. "Well, not sure of their analysis," Nixon interrupted. "I'm not going to get that involved. Bizart couldn't hear the rest of the sentence. "No, sir, we don't want you to," said Haldeman reassuringly. "You call them in," ordered Nixon. "Good deal," Haldeman responded. "Play it tough. That's the way they play it, and that's the way we are going to play it." "Okay, we'll do it." There had been no mention of national security. The president and Haldeman were using the claim to persuade the FBI through the CIA to back off from the investigation. Bizart sipped his coffee. National security was a ruse. The president and Haldeman then shifted to other business. The resignation of the chief of protocol, lobbying action on a pending revenue bill, international finance, Italian monetary problems. "I don't give a shit about the lira," Nixon remarked. As the reels slowly turned, Bizart heard the two men discuss press coverage of recent administration decisions and a statement being drafted on busing. But they came back to Watergate. The president carefully told Haldeman how to handle Helms and Walters. Let's go back. The president carefully told Haldeman how to handle Helms and Walters. "Say, look, the problem is that this will open the whole Bay of Pigs thing, and the president just feels that, without going into the details. Don't lie to them to the extent to say there is no involvement. Just say this is a comedy of errors without getting into it. The president believes that it is going to open the whole Bay of Pigs thing up again, and because these people are plugging for keeps, and that they should call the FBI in and say that we wish for the country, don't go any further into this case, period." At that, the two men turned back to Oval Office business. Bizart stopped the recorder. He rewound the reel and listened again. A second hearing did not change his impression. The tape was devastating. Bizart was overwhelmed. He had heard the president approve the plan. He had heard him suggest the exact wording. Bizart had found the smoking pistol. He had heard the president load it, aim, and fire. Bizart removed the earphones from his aching ears. He sat gazing at the files all over his desk. School's out, he thought. Only 1 week before, St. Clair had rebutted the House Judiciary Committee's charge that the president had interjected the CIA into the FBI's investigation in an effort to impede it, and he had argued on the basis of the May 22nd statement. He had quoted it at length and offered the conclusion that the president had mentioned the CIA only to prevent exposure of an unrelated covert CIA operation. St. Clair's brief had further claimed that, quote, the president had no prior knowledge of an alleged plot to obstruct justice by such means as the attempted use of the CIA to thwart the FBI's Watergate investigation, end quote. They had misled the House committee. Bozart picked up the phone. Give me San Clemente, he said. A few moments passed as he waited on the line for the White House operator to reach California and get Haig. Well, we found the smoking pistol, he began. His voice was calm and emotionless. Are you sure? Haig asked. Yes, it's the ball game. Bob told him a lot that day. Haig accepted the information coolly. He registered no surprise as Bozart outlined how the president had authorized Haldeman to contact the CIA. Bozart told him Haldeman had opened the conversation by telling the president, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control. An obvious reference to an earlier conversation, Bozart said, perhaps to June 20th, to something said in the obliterated 18.5 minutes. That could mean only one thing, Haig said. The president himself had erased the 18.5 minutes. Unfortunately, it all added up. Bozart underlined the gravity of the new problem. As head of the executive branch, the president was, of course, in charge of the FBI and the CIA. So the instruction to Haldeman was probably not, in the most technical sense, an obstruction of justice, but it was certainly an abuse of power or an abuse of agency. By almost any definition, it was an impeachable offense. Well, said Haig, what do you think we ought to do? Bozart had given it some thought. Well, we've got the court decision to think about also. I think the president ought to think about his options. If there had been a smoking gun, he would have recommended that they supply transcripts rather than the tapes to Judge Sirica and make the argument that that constituted compliance, but that option was now closed. To do so now could make them all party to a crime. The president could turn over the tapes and hope for the best, but the more realistic choice was to turn over nothing, Bozart said. This could be done only if the president resigned. Resignation would abort the Judiciary Committee's impeachment investigation and thus end the committee's need for the tapes. As for the special prosecutor, the only way to end his need for the tapes would be to stop all prosecutions by pardoning everyone. Refusal to comply with the Supreme Court decision, Bozart reiterated, would pretty much have to involve both resignation and pardons. He was inclined to favor the idea. There was another strong reason for the president to resign, Bozart added. The brief that had been submitted to the House Judiciary Committee had included a serious misrepresentation about what happened on June 23, 1972. Bozart reminded Haig that if a lawyer had been party to misleading a court, he is obligated to get his client to change his plea or correct the misrepresentation himself. Resignation would constitute a change in plea before the House inquiry. The only other choice was to disclose the tape at once. Haig told Bozart that he and St. Clair would go over to see the president soon. We'll get back to you. Just after 1 p.m., Bozart walked across West Executive Avenue to the West Wing to join Timmons, Birch, and Garment for lunch in the White House mess. Their expressions were grim. They were discussing the court's decision, and as he sat down at the table, Bozart offered no hint of what he knew. Timmons was arguing that the president had to resign. He was proceeding on the assumption that the tapes were bad, otherwise the president wouldn't have fought so hard to keep them. He suggested that Nixon resign over the issue of preserving the confidentiality of presidential conversations. He felt that the president was better off pleading an ultimate executive privilege, refusing to turn over any tapes, burning them if need be, on the grounds that to turn them over would irreparably damage the presidency. That way he would leave on principle instead of being hauled out. Timmons had asked Haig that morning, how much consideration are you giving to resignation? Haig had been noncommittal. He had replied simply that every option was being considered. Timmons' arguments were better received now at lunch. Bozart and Birch agreed with him. Garment shifted in his chair and expressed surprise that they wanted to throw in the towel so quickly. He said he had talked with Charlie Wright that morning. Wright had urged that they not allow a precedent in which the Congress drove a president from office without a vote in the constitutionally mandated manner. There was a certain purity in taking it through to the end, Garment argued. The others were unpersuaded. After lunch, Garment and Bozart strolled back across West Executive Avenue to their offices. As they walked into the early afternoon sun, Garment asked, "What's up?" Bozart straightened slightly and squinted at him. "It's bad, Len." Garment didn't press for details. He anticipated the worst. Bozart's mind was focused on the question of pardons. Ever since he had become counsel to the president, he had been cautious about recommending the use of the presidential pardon power. Now he was contemplating pardons for a whole category of men who had been or might become Watergate defendants. He had his staff review all who would have to be pardoned if the president resigned and refused to turn over the tapes. It was a long and varied list. Over 30 men, ranging from Herbert L. Bart Porter, a minor official of the Nixon Reelection Committee, who had pleaded guilty to lying to FBI agents, to Howard Hunt, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell. The last three had not yet even been tried. The president could not pardon some and not others. And we're going to stop this session at this point. We're still on July 24th, Wednesday, July 24th, 1974, which, as you see, was a very significant day in the final days of the Nixon presidency and bringing about the final days of the Nixon presidency. So we'll take up in the next session again, continuing on Wednesday, July 24th, 1974, the final days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thanks for watching.